Chapter 3. Duncan felt the air rush past him as he slid down the rope at sunset, scaling down the majestic peaks of Kos, holding on for dear life as he slid faster than he'd imagined possible. All around him the men slid too. Anvin and Artfail, Sivig, Kavos, Bramthos, and thousands of others. Duncan's, Sivig's, and Kavos's men joining together as one army, all sliding down the ice in rows. A well-disciplined army, leapfrogging over each other, all of them desperate to reach the bottom before they were detected. As Duncan's feet touched the ice, he immediately pushed off again, rappelling downward, his hands spared from being torn to shreds only by the thick gloves Kavos had given him. Duncan marveled at how fast his army moved, all in a near freefall down the cliff. When he had been atop Kos, he'd had no idea how Kavos had planned on getting an army this size down so quickly without losing men. He hadn't realized they'd had such an intricate array of ropes and picks that could get them down so smoothly. These were men made for the ice, and for them this lightning-fast descent was like a casual hike. He finally understood what they'd meant when they'd said the men of Kos were not trapped up here, but rather the Pandesians down below were the ones who were trapped. Kavos suddenly came to an abrupt stop, landing with both feet on a wide and broad plateau protruding from the mountain, and Duncan stopped beside him, as did all the men, momentarily pausing halfway down the mountain face. Kavos walked over to the edge, and Duncan joined him, leaning over, seeing the ropes dangling far beneath. Through them, far below, through the mist and final rays of the sun, Duncan could see at the mountain's base a sprawling stone Pandesian garrison, teeming with thousands of soldiers. Duncan looked over at Kavos, and Kavos looked back, delight in his eyes. It was a delight Duncan recognized, one he had seen many times in his life, the ecstasy of a true warrior about to go to war. It was what men like Kavos lived for. Duncan felt it himself, he had to admit, that tingling in his veins, that tightness in his gut. The sight of those Pandesians made him as excited for the thrill of battle as the next man. "You could have descended anywhere," Duncan said, examining the landscape below. "Most of it is empty. We could have avoided confrontation and moved on to the capital. Yet you chose the spot where the Pandesians are strongest." Kavos smiled broadly. "I did," he replied. "The men of Kavos do not look to avoid confrontation. We seek it out." He grinned wider. "Besides," he added, "an early battle will warm us for our march on the capital, and I want to make these Pandesians think twice the next time they decide to surround the base of our mountain." Kavos turned and nodded to his commander, Bramthos, and Bramthos rallied their men and joined Kavos as they all rushed for a massive ice boulder perched at the edge of the cliff. They all, as one, leaned their shoulders into it. Duncan, realizing what they were doing, nodded to Anvin and Artfail, who rallied their men too. Sivig and his men joined them, and as one, they all pushed. Duncan dug his feet into the ice and pushed, straining under the weight of it, slipping, pushing with all he had. They all groaned, and slowly the massive boulder began to roll. "A welcoming present?" Duncan asked, smiling, grunting beside Kavos. Kavos grinned back. "Just a little something to announce our arrival." A moment later, Duncan felt a great release, heard a cracking of ice, and he leaned over and watched in awe as the boulder rolled over the edge of the plateau. He stepped back quickly with the others and watched as the boulder hurled down at full speed, rolling, bouncing off the ice wall, gaining speed. The massive boulder, with a diameter of at least 30 feet, fell straight down, rushing like an angel of death for the Pandesian fortress below. Duncan braced himself for the explosion to follow. All of those soldiers below, unwitting, waiting targets. The boulder struck the center of the stone garrison, and the crash was greater than anything Duncan had heard in his life. It was as if a comet had struck Escalon, a boom echoing so loudly he had to cover his ears, the ground shaking beneath him, making him stumble. An enormous cloud of stone and ice rose up, dozens of feet high, and the air, even from up here, became audible with the terrified shouts and cries of men. Half the stone garrison was destroyed on impact, and the boulder continued to roll, crushing men, flattening buildings, leaving a wake of destruction and chaos. "Men of Kos!" shouted Kavos. "Who has dared approach our mountain?" There came a great shout as his thousands of warriors suddenly charged forward and leapt off the edge of the cliff, following Kavos, all grabbing ropes and rappelling so fast they were practically free-falling down the mountain. Duncan followed, his men behind him, all jumping too, grabbing onto the ropes and descending so fast he could barely breathe. He felt certain he would break his neck upon impact. Seconds later, he found himself landing hard at the base, hundreds of feet below, descending into a huge cloud of ice and dust, the rumble still echoing from the rolling boulder. All the men turned and faced the garrison, and they all let out a great battle cry as they drew their swords and charged, pushing headlong into the chaos of the Pandesian camp. The Pandesian soldiers, still reeling from the explosion, turned with shocked faces to see the army charging. Clearly, they had not expected this. Dazed, caught off guard, several of their commanders lying there dead, crushed by the boulder. They seemed too disoriented to even think straight. As Duncan and Kavos and their men bore down on them, some began to turn and run. Others reached for swords, but Duncan and his men descended upon them like locusts and stabbed them before they even had a chance to draw. Duncan and the men rushed through the camp, never hesitating, knowing time was of the essence, and they felled the recovering soldiers on every side, following the trail of destruction left by the boulder. Duncan slashed every which way, stabbing one soldier in the chest, smashing another in the face with the hilt of his sword, kicking one who charged him, and ducking and laying his shoulder into another, as the man swung an axe at his head. Duncan did not pause, felling everyone in his path, breathing hard, knowing they were still outnumbered, and that he had to kill as many as he could, as quickly as he could. Beside him, Anvin, Artfail, and his men joined him, all watching each other's backs, all rushing forward and slashing and defending in every direction as the clangs of warfare filled the garrison. Embroiled in a full-scale battle, Duncan knew it would have been wiser to have conserved his men's energy, to have avoided this confrontation and marched to Andros. But he also knew that honor compelled the men of Kos to fight this battle, and he understood how they felt. The wisest course of action was not always what moved men's hearts. They moved through the camp with speed and discipline, the Pandesians in such disarray that they were barely able to put up an organized defense. Every time a commander surfaced or a company formed, Duncan and his men hacked them down. Duncan and his men rushed through the garrison like a storm, and hardly an hour had passed when Duncan finally stood there, at the end of the fort, turning every which way, and realized, blood spattered, that there was no one left to kill. He stood there, breathing hard as twilight fell, a mist settling over the mountains, all uncannily silent. The fort was theirs. The men, realizing, let out a spontaneous cheer, and Duncan stood there, Anvin, Arthfail, Sivig, Kavos, and Bramthos coming up beside him, wiping blood from his sword, his armor, and taking it all in. He noticed a wound on Kavos's arm seeping blood. "You're wounded," he pointed out to Kavos, who didn't seem to notice. Kavos looked down at it and shrugged. He then smiled. "A beauty scratch," he replied. Duncan surveyed the battlefield. So many men dead, mostly Pandesians and few of his own men. He then looked up and saw the ice peaks of Kos towering over them, disappearing in the clouds, and he was in awe at how high they had climbed, and how fast they had descended. It had been a lightning attack, like death raining down from the sky. And it had worked. The Pandesian garrison, seeming so indomitable but hours ago, was now theirs, nothing but a flattened ruin, all its men lying in pools of blood, dead beneath the twilight sky. It was surreal. The warriors of Kos spared no one, took no mercy, and had been an unstoppable force. Duncan had a fresh respect for them. They would be crucial partners in liberating Escalon. Kavos surveyed the corpses, breathing hard too. "That is what I call an exit plan," he said. Duncan saw him grinning as he surveyed the enemy bodies, watching their men stripping the dead of their weapons. Duncan nodded. "And a fine exit it was," he replied. Duncan turned and looked west, past the fort, into the setting sun, and motion caught his eye. He squinted and saw a sight which filled his heart with warmth, a sight which somehow he had expected to see. There on the horizon stood his warhorse, standing proudly before the herd, hundreds of warhorses behind him. He had, as always, sensed where Duncan would be, and was there, loyally awaiting him. Duncan's heart lifted, knowing his old friend would bring his army the rest of the way to the capital. Duncan whistled, and as he did, his horse turned and ran for him. The other horses followed, and there came a great rumble in the twilight as the herd galloped through the snowy plain, heading right for them. Kavos nodded in admiration beside him. "Horses," Kavos remarked, watching them approach. "I myself would have walked to Andros." Duncan grinned. "I'm sure you would have, my friend." Duncan stepped forward as his horse approached and caressed his old friend's mane. He mounted him, and as he did, all his men mounted with him, thousands of them, an army on horseback. They sat there, fully armed, staring into the twilight. Nothing before them now but the snowy plains leading to the capital. Duncan felt a rush of excitement as he felt, finally, that they were on the brink. He could feel it, could smell victory in the air. Kavos had gotten them down the mountain. Now, it was his show. Duncan raised his sword, feeling the eyes of all the men, all the armies upon him. "Men!" he called out. "To Andros!" They all let out a great battle cry and charged with him into the night, across the snowy plains, all prepared to stop at nothing until they had reached the capital and waged the greatest war of their lives.